Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us here at Ifri and remotely. I am Marc Julien, Director of Ifri's Center for Asian Studies, and I am honored to host today's distinguished panel of speakers who join us from across the globe. First of all, Dr. Li Zhuan, Research Fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, the INDSR, based in Taipei. And on my right, Dr. Nessoun Maboubi, Director of the PEN Project on the Future of US-China Relations, what a topic for today's discussion, at the University of Pennsylvania, United States. I am also delighted to welcome Maëlys Penlazus, a reporter with Nikkei Asia, based in Paris. Thank you, Maëlys, for joining us. We gather today roughly 50 days into Donald Trump's second term. So far, his administration has primarily focused on its immediate neighborhood and also on Europe, with a strong emphasis on resolving the Ukrainian war as far as possible, which means forcing the victim to capitulate and the invader to triumph. This situation has sparked a significant strategic crisis for Europe, prompting a fundamental reassessment of transatlantic relations. However, this crisis should not divert our attention from the critical development unfolding in East Asia. While President Trump has been relatively quiet on China, on East Asian allies, as well as on Taiwan, strategic competition between the US and China remains very intense. Many indicators suggest that the Trump administration primary focus continues to be China. Let's see if our esteemed speakers agree on this point. Within this strategic competition, it is uneasy to understand what role Taiwan can play in Trump's policy toward East Asia. Some analysts argue that for strategic and geostrategic reasons, Trump will maintain political and military support for Taiwan, continuing to some extent the policies of the Biden administration and predecessors. Others speculate that, similar to the situation in Ukraine, Trump might abandon Taiwan to secure a deal with Xi Jinping. While this scenario remains hypothetical, the fear among many Taiwanese that Trump may abandon them is very real. With this thought, I am very pleased to turn the floor to Dr. Li Zhuan, who will share his perspective from Taiwan for roughly 15 minutes, and then I will turn to Dr. Maboubi for an American perspective, and later on we will open the floor to the public here at Ifri and online. So feel free to prepare your question, and you can ask them online as soon as you want. Dr. Li, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zhuan Li, research fellow from INDSR, Taipei, Taiwan. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Mark and John, and of course, Ifri, for inviting me here. It's great to be back again to Paris and to share with you my thoughts and learn from your expertise and insights. Today, my presentation is going to be a three-part thing. The first part is about US-Taiwan relations in Trump 2.0 administration. I think we all agree that we are likely at a pivotal moment in history. President Trump is taking drastic measures seems to be trying to revive America and maintain its global hegemony. So that is why terms like reindustrialization or reciprocal tariff have gained prominence in media. And I believe in the years to come, the fierce competition between China and the United States may have a more obvious result. Compared to his first term, I would say Trump 2.0 is marked by a stronger geopolitical focus in his rhetoric. So we heard that Trump has mentioned that the United States should reclaim the Panama Canal and even acquire Greenland. Another case is his proposal to align with Russia to counter China. And I believe his push for TSMC to invest in the United States and his insistence that Taiwan has to pay more for its own defense are also closely related to geopolitical concerns. So regarding Taiwan, I think Trump's demands are relatively predictable because his accusation during last year's campaign saying that Taiwan has stolen the chip industry of the United States, it was not new. Actually, back in 2019, when it was still Trump 1.0, he has done that against Taiwan's semiconductor industry. And it is also the same year TSMC had, for the first time, announced its plan to set up factory in Arizona. That was the same year. So additionally, throughout the election campaign last year, Trump and his former aides also repeatedly, for many times, suggested that Taiwan should pay more for its defense budget to increase, say, like 5% or even 10% of Taiwan's GDP. In reality, we also know that it was not new. So that is the reason why, under the leadership of former President Madame Tsai, in her 8 years of leadership, Taiwan has increased its defense budget by more than 80%. It's 80.5%, and which approximately equal to almost 2.5% of Taiwan's GDP. And looking ahead to 2025, President Lai said last month that he will prioritize preparing a so-called special budget by Taiwan to ensure that the defense spending surpasses 3% of Taiwan's GDP. So that is for sure. For the 4 years to come under Trump 2.0, I think there are still a lot of uncertainty, but I would say US-Taiwan relations will remain highly visible as both nations share significant geopolitical interest. TSMC's role will be critical in maintaining US leadership in AI technology, in its smartphone, or in its manufacture of most advanced weapons. That is for sure. And meanwhile, Taiwan will continue to enhance its self-defense capabilities and societal resilience, which already was kicked off last September by President Lai. To ensure that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait will continue and deterring potential aggression from mainland China. And additionally, I believe Taiwan will also deepen its collaboration with the United States through so-called integrated diplomacy. There was the term put forth by Lai administration last year, meaning Taiwan were using its technological, industrial, or medical, or economic strength to help countries in Latin America and perhaps in country in Pacific Islands. My second part is about major issues Taiwan is dealing with regarding cross-strait relations. We know in recent years, Taiwan has been facing a range of gray zone threats from the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and the People's Liberation Army. It spanned from legal, diplomatic, and military domains. To make it briefly, legally, the CCP seeks to erode ROC or Taiwan's sovereignty by rejecting the existence of the median line in the Taiwan Strait and denying the prohibited and restricted water set up by Taiwan Authority that equals to territorial water and adjacent zone. And also asserting jurisdiction over Taiwan's territorial water. And diplomatically, Taiwan has lost 10 diplomatic allies in the past 8 years, while China has garnered support from more than 70 countries supporting China's effort for so-called national unification by any means, peaceful or otherwise. That means if China were to invade Taiwan, many countries in this world may view it as merely a civil war for Chinese. So that is not an act of aggression. Even if the United Nations tried to pass a resolution to condemn China for its aggression, it is unlikely to succeed. And militarily, the PLA has escalated its activity around Taiwan, frequently breaching Taiwan's so-called Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, and crossing the median line of the strait. It is worthwhile that following the visit of Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of US House of Representatives in August 2022, large scale conducted by the PLA becomes routine. Every year they have a very large scale, which was very rare before 2022. And every 7 to 10 days, PLA conduct so-called combat readiness patrol. It involves about 7 to 10 military aircraft and about 4 vessels conducting their small exercise around Taiwan. And of course, daily incursions by dozens of PLA aircraft and warship have happened on a daily basis. The highest record in one day, in 24 hours, is more than 103 aircraft in 24 hours. That is the reason why last month, US Indo-Pacific Command Admiral Samuel Papero stated that those maneuvers are not just exercises. They were rehearsal for a potential military invasion aimed at unifying Taiwan with China by force. So in response, Taiwan has been bolstering its defense posture by increasing military spending, extending its compulsory services to 1 year, and strengthening its reservist training, and investing in so-called asymmetric warfare capabilities. The so-called porcupine strategy prioritize cost-effective mobile defense system designed to make any possible invasion attempt prohibitively costly for China. And of course, continued support from the United States or Japan and the European countries also very crucial in deterring aggression and maintaining stability in the Taiwan Strait. And my third part to share is about what we can hope for the relations with the United States and what are the defining elements of Taiwan's approach. There was an old saying very popular in Taiwan, came from an ancient Chinese philosopher whose name is Mencius. He was born 2,400 years ago. He emphasized benevolence and righteousness in statecraft. He advised that powerful nations should engage generously with smaller ones and refraining from exploitation and excessive demands, while smaller nations should remain vigilant and prudent to safeguard their own survival. For the case of Taiwan, situated between China and the United States, it is for sure that Taiwan must navigate its own foreign policy, military strategy, and economic development with caution. There was a lot of debate in Taiwan. For instance, probably we can try to propose having a peaceful agreement with mainland China. How about that? My personal opinion is that facing an adversary determined to annex Taiwan, seeking peaceful agreement without sufficient deterrence could be perceived as weakness. That's my personal opinion. And I believe it will potentially invite aggression. So therefore, I believe robust military preparedness is essential. And of course, securing United States support and highlighting the high costs of aggression against Taiwan are critical components of Taiwan's deterrence strategy. As for the United States, Washington has maintained its obvious a policy of so-called strategic ambiguity, which means U.S. has been refraining from explicitly stating how it will respond to a forceful attempt at unification. It will never say yes or no. However, the Trump administration is expected to take active measures to prevent a Chinese invasion. We can see that from Trump 1.0, the total number of arms sales to Taiwan is actually twofolds of the number of the Biden administration. He is even more willing to sell weapons to Taiwan. And for the bigger and stronger conventional weapon and platform. And this suggests optimism for continued military support from the United States in the future. Similarly, I personally believe that demonstrating kind of pragmatism and flexibility in diplomacy without exercise too much commitment to Beijing could also reinforce Taiwan's autonomy without provoking Beijing or severing formal ties with the PRC. The United States can serve as one example. We know that the United States diplomatically recognized the PRC, but it has never officially recognized Taiwan as part of China. So this demonstrated that the like-minded countries do not need to overcommit themselves to Beijing. And a research by Lowy Institute in Australia also showed that more than 40 democratic countries in the world, they don't really agree that Taiwan is part of China, even though they have formal ties with mainland China. So I think that is one way which could be important, especially when China seeks to annex democratic Taiwan through non-peaceful means. And my last but not the least one is that the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which was new, only established back in 2020, along with countries such as Australia and the Netherlands Congress, as well as the United States Department of State. They have begun to challenge China's misinterpretation of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758. They argue that the resolution neither determined Taiwan's sovereignty nor preclude Taiwan's participation in international organizations. These efforts could counter Beijing's one China narrative and help Taiwan expand its international presence. Thank you. I'll stop there, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. You mentioned by the end of your statement the strategic ambiguity, so perhaps you, Dr. Mahboubi, you will address this issue. Are we still in strategic ambiguity in the United States? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And also generally for this wonderful opportunity to you and to John and to Ifri. It's really a pleasure to be here for the first time at Ifri, which is really it's a remarkable institution that I'm very glad to be at. I come from the United States, which I think we're still friends. I come in peace. There is a lot of stuff going on in my country right now. And as you all aware, countries in Europe are trying to figure out what direction we're going in. Perhaps you'll understand that those of us in the United States are also trying to figure that out. But I hope, at least for purposes of today's discussion, we are not strategic competitors or strategic adversaries, but rather in a spirit of friendship. Of course, I'm trying to be somewhat humorous, but it is a very, let's say, interesting at least, and perhaps even confusing time in the United States. There's a lot of different signals on a lot of issues, including domestic, but also in terms of foreign policy. And so I will do my best to kind of weave through this hazy picture from back home and try to bring some clarity as much as I can to the discussion at hand today. To the extent that we are talking about Taiwan, I think I would want to start off by saying that there is, in my view, a very strong bipartisan consensus that it is both strategically, economically, and morally in the United States' interest to preserve peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and to help to avoid any kind of non-peaceful coercion takeover of Taiwan by China. I think even in these complicated times, there's a great deal of clarity about that point. Where there are differences include on the question of how best to preserve peace and stability, include on the question of what the long-term prognosis can or should be, and include on the question of what we would ask of the Taiwanese themselves to help to preserve this. There is quite a lot of debate on those questions, but I think on the primary question of preserving peace and stability and maintaining essentially this remarkable status quo that has existed certainly since the normalization of relations between the United States and China in 1979, but even going back to the end of the Korean War in 1953, I think there is quite a strong consensus on that. To understand what may happen in this next phase under the Trump administration vis-a-vis Taiwan, I think it's important to maybe set the table by, to the best of my ability, conveying what it looks like the second Trump administration is thinking or may do vis-a-vis China more broadly. It's very clear that the first Trump administration marked a clear inflection point, demarcation in shifting overall the US relationship with China in a much more competitive and some might even say bordering on confrontational direction. This was clear throughout the first Trump administration, but became much sharper after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that last year of the Trump administration saw a wide range of actions across many different spheres, which really brought US-China relations to the lowest point that has certainly been the case in my lifetime and in many, many years. Many of us expected those dynamics to come back into play once the second Trump administration began. And many, not all, but many of the appointments that President Trump has made across the relevant government agencies would seem to be consistent with taking a more confrontational approach to China economically, certainly, but also maybe in other ways as well. And what is genuinely surprising to me, and I think to many other observers of the US-China relationship, is that while those signals still are apparent, on the whole, things between the US and China seem more stable right now than many of us expected them to. And that is, in many respects, maybe entirely because of President Trump himself, who has very clearly signaled that he is interested in reaching some kind of agreement with President Xi Jinping, and specifically on trade and economics. We have not seen anything like the full range of actions that happened, especially at the end of the first Trump administration, from this administration. And that includes on tariffs. Yes, there have been tariffs imposed, but nowhere near what President Trump had suggested on the campaign trail. There is movement towards enhanced scrutiny of Chinese investments in the US and also of American businesses being able to export technologies to China. But these are all still somewhat inchoate. They're not as sharp and clear as many of us had expected. And President Trump's language about President Xi Jinping and about US-China relations has seemed much more conciliatory than many of us expected. And it's clear that he's very interested in some kind of a one-on-one meeting that may take place in April, may take place in June, may even involve a state visit to China. All of these are very hard to figure out right now. And it's clear that many of the more hawkish forces or personnel within the Trump administration who would like to see a more confrontational relationship or think we should be treating China as more of a clear competitive threat are holding their fire for the moment and waiting to see what the signal from the top will be. And the Chinese, for their part, have put forward a proposal for an economic grand bargain that at least indicates that the Chinese themselves see an opportunity here. Whether that will all yield some kind of a grand bargain, I would not bet on it, but we are at least in this holding pattern right now in the US to see what happens when perhaps the two presidents meet and kind of what happens after that. Adding to this is that it is clear that President Trump himself and the Trump administration want to focus on Ukraine first, and then perhaps pivot to more fulsomely looking at the US-China relationship. And there's quotes from many people around the Trump administration suggesting that they think of the Ukraine issue as an easier issue and one that can be solved in the short term. And that once it is solved, then they can focus all of their attention to figuring out what to do vis-a-vis China. Now, I think it should not go without saying to a European audience that I am aware that the Ukraine issue is quite complicated, and I'm not myself confident that there is a simple solution there, but that is at least part of why the people around President Trump are indicating that we have not seen a more fulsome attention and approach towards China. What does this all imply for Taiwan? Many of the people who have been appointed by President Trump to different positions in his administration, not all, but many of them have been very clear in their support of Taiwan, and even beyond the strict lines of that bipartisan consensus I started my remarks with, that want to see us do more, that want to see a more robust American clear support of Taiwan beyond even the contours of the so-called strategic ambiguity that has defined the American approach for a very long time, and who want us to be thinking very sharply about what it would take to militarily defend Taiwan, what kind of resources need to be expanded within the US military, and how to get the Taiwanese military to be prepared for that as well. And many of those voices are quite convinced that President Xi Jinping is on a mission to take over Taiwan in a short period of time, and that we need to be pushing back on that as robustly and aggressively now as possible. It's not clear that President Trump views this issue in the same way. I'm not saying he doesn't or that he does. Frankly, I don't know. And if anyone from the US context were to tell you that they knew with a certainty, don't believe them, because I don't think anyone knows. He has certainly said things on occasion that have conveyed maybe less of a robust support for Taiwan, and have given people reason to think that under the right set of economic grand bargain terms between the US and China, a deal between himself and President Xi Jinping, he would not, President Trump, necessarily think of defense of Taiwan as being part of America's core national interests. But he has appointed many people in his government who do think that. What's the takeaway? How do we interpret that? Lots of people, much smarter than me, have been trying to figure this out, and I genuinely don't think anyone knows. I think it's all really uncertain right now. If we look at some of the steps that the Biden administration took on this issue, we know that President Biden, in his own language, pushed the boundaries of strategic ambiguity, saying on a number of occasions to the chagrin, or at least perhaps the chagrin of his staff, that the US would certainly intervene in support of Taiwan if it came to a military conflict across the Taiwan Strait. I've never heard President Trump say anything like that. We know that the Biden administration poured a lot of its diplomatic energies into strengthening alliances and partnerships in Indo-Pacific, including, I'm sorry to say, vis-a-vis Australia with the AUKUS deal. I apologize to the French audience for bringing this up. But this was something that the Biden administration thought was really central to its deterrence of China across the Taiwan Strait, strengthening these alliances and partners in the Indo-Pacific. And there are people within the Trump orbit who I think appreciate that and would want to continue in that vein. But again, it's not clear that President Trump thinks that way, and that he, sees the relations with Japan, Korea, Australia through the same lens vis-a-vis Taiwan. Also, I think I should acknowledge that while it is not specifically on the issue of Taiwan, some of President Trump's comments about Greenland, about Canada, as complicated as they might be on their own terms, and again, don't ask me if we're really going to invade Greenland. I don't know. I don't think so. I hope we don't. But again, these are things that are in our context now that are puzzling for Americans themselves to figure out. What those statements do on their own terms may be problematic what they convey to European allies and partners and Canadian friends may be problematic. It does seem like it does open up the Overton window for leaders of other countries to lay claim to areas near them that they think are part of their strategic interests. It does, in some respects, buttress Vladimir Putin's argument vis-a-vis Ukraine, and perhaps buttresses Xi Jinping, China's claim to Taiwan. I don't want to overstate that case because these are all different parts of the world, and no one from the administration, certainly not President Trump, has ever explicitly said, this is mine, you can have that, you can have that. But it's not helpful if we think part of the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is this principle that you can't just go and take parts of the world that you think you have a claim towards. Let me close by just saying that everything that I've said, to the extent that I've said anything, is obviously speculative. We will get some more clarity on these issues in the coming months, including before and after a meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi, including once we know whether there is some kind of an economic deal to be had there, what the contours of that deal are, and including after many of the federal agencies that have been tasked by President Trump to undergo an initial 100-day review of policies toward China come back with their ideas. And some of those ideas could be quite confrontational. They could include trying to revoke China's permanent normal trading relation status with the US, could even move towards complete economic decoupling with China. If that is the direction, then of course the US-China relationship and its more confrontational direction will have implications for Taiwan. I'm not saying that that will happen, but we will at least get more clarity in the coming months whether that is the directionality. Hopefully we'll have at least some sense of what's happening vis-a-vis Ukraine. If it is a quick solution, that will be one thing, but if it turns out to clearly not be a quick solution, and I think obviously Europe will have a big role to play in that. What Europe collectively does vis-a-vis that particular crisis will determine to what extent US policymakers think that Ukraine is an easily solvable issue or not. We'll know more about that. So let me come back in a few months. I'd love to come back to France anytime and report back to them. But as of today, March of 2025, what I've conveyed is the best that I can do, and I think most people could do on a very hazy and unclear picture at the current moment.
Thank you very much, Nessun. Needless to say that you're welcome here as a friend, and we'll still be very happy to welcome many friends from the US to discuss transatlantic relations. Thank you for your question. It's not so easy to discuss American politics and American foreign policy these days, but we need to brainstorm to try to decipher what's going on. Maëlys, just to introduce you a little bit more, I don't know in which order to put it, but you are a reporter, French, working for Japanese media. You used to live in Asia. So I'm very interested to have your view on this issue, perhaps from a European / Asian perspective.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me, and thank you to Ifri. I'm very happy to be here. I'm afraid I have more questions than things to say because that's a professional bias, but I have a few things I'd like to underline with a European perspective and also maybe a media perspective about like observing European media and how we talk about Taiwan and the threats of Taiwan in Europe. Well, the first thing I think that's unavoidable right now when we talk about Taiwan in Europe is the parallel with Ukraine. So right now from Europe, analysts and especially journalists and European media cannot help but compare Taiwan with Ukraine and underline all the similarities between the invasion of Ukraine and the lingering threat on Taiwan. That's because for Europe, the war against Ukraine was felt as a wake-up call that today nobody's out of reach, even in Asia. So even though there's a status quo in Asia, now in Europe, journalists and observers can understand the Chinese threat as way more urgent than in the past, because we right now are confronted with war in the European continent. So very naturally, European media now read the situation in Ukraine in the Strait with this framework in mind and with anxiety. And so my first reaction thinking about that was wondering, and I want to ask you all about it, if it's is it indeed a European bias to always understand the issue in Taiwan with so many parallels with Ukraine? And is it a European lens? And even though we can agree that it's a European bias, do you think it's a relevant bias? Do you think it's relevant to make a parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan? I've talked with several scholars and analysts about it, like French or European and Taiwanese scholars, and everybody seemed to disagree because there are many topics in this topic of Ukraine and Taiwan. So one thing is in really recent events, the way Trump acted with Ukraine, that is, of course, closely watched in Asia for good reasons, because the attempt by the US administration to make a land for peace deal with Ukraine can be understood as undermining the international order. So it's not only about Europe, because it can set a precedent that is closely watched, I think, in Taiwan and in Asia, because in Asia right now, and sometimes I feel it's a bit forgotten, it can be forgotten by some European media, is that there's a lot of disputes in Asia compared to Western Europe, especially. And so setting a precedent in Ukraine that violence and wars of aggression can be rewarded by land is something that can be of concern for many Asian countries, especially, well, regarding vis-a-vis China, because a lot of these disputes include China and also Russia, like in the case of Japan and the north of the islands in the north of Japan. So of course, the fact that Russia is ready to invade Ukraine is also a direct concern for countries in Asia, because Russia is reaching Asia and set a precedent of invading territories, even though if it's now in Russia, but well, it's disputed. So yeah, first I would like to ask you about this, but we can talk about this later. But I think I quite agree with everything you said about the Trump 2 administration, and that there is a certain confidence about the continuation of American-US politics vis-a-vis Taiwan. But at the same time, I think it's still interesting to see that the behavior of Trump in Europe show that there's a change of paradigm in the fact that he's trying to push a land for peace deal in Ukraine. Well, that being said, I think a lot of European media tend to overreact, or maybe like overestimate what's happening in Taiwan. What I mean is, like, I don't think they overestimate the reality of China threat in Taiwan, but European media are choosing angle that sometimes make European people feel that China is going to invade Taiwan in a really like tangible, quick way, like in the coming years. And so that's also something I think I would be interested to ask a few questions about it, because of course, that's also bias, but I think the public is not always understanding what this Chinese threat to Taiwan mean in really, really tangible way, and not only about like, I read a recent article you wrote about like the similarities between wars of aggression and assertive, aggressive policies. And I think that's something that would be interesting to talk about, because I think it's difficult to be balanced when we talk, for example, about the increasing tensions in the Strait or from the Chinese military in Asia, in the sea, because at the same time, I think we tend to forget to in Europe that Asia, even though it's peaceful, let's say, there are a lot of tensions between countries. And at the same time, countries are really economically intertwined, which is something that can be not forgotten in Europe, but that can be a little abstract, especially in the EU, because we live in a community of countries where we don't have wars and everybody kind of agree. In Asia, you have like historic rivals that really don't agree and with really, really different value systems. And yet they are really, really intertwined economically. And that's also something that I think is important to underline, because that really, like the economic aspect is something I would like to talk a little more after, because that's really important too. And I think that's really different from Europe. But of course, European journalists or media can understand forget like the really deeply intertwined links between even like Japan and China or Japan and South Korea. It's a bit more complicated context than in Europe in many aspects, even like in historical legacy and so on. So, but switching to another topic, I wanted to ask you as well about the gap between security issues regarding Taiwan and economic issues, because they are both really, really intertwined as well, especially given like the chips industry, TSMC, and it's widely understood that chip manufacturing is key to Taiwan's security, economic security, but like it's a deterrence tool, even though it's economic. So it's really intertwined. But at the same time, I'm wondering about Trump and his deal-making abilities, because I've read a lot of analysis about people worrying that he could bargain Taiwan for economic interest, but other observers tend to say that even though President Trump loves a good deal, he actually separates security concerns, also like strategic, like the strategic interest of the US and therefore allies in the Indo-Pacific, and trade interest. So I think that would be interesting to see, because also, and I think that's also media bias, but we tend to sometimes mix economics and defense, but it's not the same person taking the decision. So it's not like the Taiwanese government taking economic decisions, or they all have really different perspective. And I would like to see with you how to articulate like the power of TSMC, and maybe talk a little about also this recent deal, like this recent announced by TSMC to invest $100 billion in Arizona, which is also something I have many questions. For example, do you think it's a wise move, a clever move to try to appease President Trump before he even gets a chance to bite, let's say? Or is it, on the contrary, losing a chance to negotiate because they already, like TSMC is already giving something for Trump. So what's left in the negotiation? And once again, that being said, is it really something so big to give for Taiwan or not? Is it like a diplomatic move? Is it something to please Trump, but that's not that dangerous for Taiwan to give away? Because some voices in Taiwan are mentioning that that could be a strategic risk to give their main card, which is chips, to the US, like while investing so much. One last thing I wanted to add is about, like, I mentioned it, but the Asian context, that's also interesting. Of course, with the China, US, and Taiwan relation, but we can wonder if the Trump administration is going to, I mean, to what extent Trump can put pressure on Taiwan, given that the US indeed has really strong interest in the Indo-Pacific and really strong interest in maintaining peace in the Indo-Pacific, which is a shared interest with China. So, and by also big powers in Asia, like Japan. So we saw that Japan made a first move with the Trump administration and showed goodwill to ramp up defense spendings and start on the new relation with Trump on quite a good position. So I think, yeah, this one last thing is that Trump is going to make deals, as he does, but it's not the same situation as in Europe. I think American interest right now in the US, both like in terms of security in the Indo-Pacific and economic issues, are really, really different than Europe. So I think we can wonder about how brutal the deal making can be compared to Europe, where it's really brutal in the way he talks with Zelensky, for example. Given that it's so important for the US to maintain peace, for China too, for Japan, and for all the countries in the region. I'm going to stop there. I have many questions if we can discuss, but.
Thank you very much, Meli. So if I may pass by your questions to our two panelists. One of the first was, what kind of parallel can we make between Ukraine and Taiwan, if ever it is relevant to make any parallel, or is it biased? And another very important question that you raised is whether or not Trump distinguished between security and trade interest, and in the case of TSMC, at least second investment in Arizona of $100 billion. Whether it was perhaps too soon to make an investment. If I may add two more questions before opening the floor to the room. One for you, Zhejuan, is about public opinion in Taiwan, because we've seen very recently, over the past few weeks, actually since this very awful meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump in the Oval Office, that Taiwan could be the next, and that Trump could very well abandon Taiwan overnight, just like he seems to be abandoning Ukraine. So it seems that there is raising concerns within the Taiwanese society. What can you tell us more about that? Is it significant, and can he have it has some influence, impact on domestic policy, on the legislative votes, and so on? And to you, Nessun, I wonder, you didn't mention this theory of reverse Nixon. This is something, at least we've been talking here. What about in the US? Whether or not Trump would be, as you said, you would be willing to settle a deal with Putin in order to settle down the Ukrainian war, to finish the Ukrainian war, but then to make a new contentment, a new front against China with Russia, just as Nixon and Kissinger did during the Cold War with China, with Mao's China against USSR. You you shoot first, Jujuan.
Okay. Thank you. 3 questions for me. The first one, is there any parallel or similarity between Ukraine and Taiwan? My answer is that it depends on what you mean by similarity or parallels. You know, there is a island called Island of Province or Province Islands. It's on the border of the United States and Canada. Its a shape is so similar like the shape of Taiwan. I didn't know that before. So that's another parallel, almost identical to the Taiwan Islands. But to talk about Taiwan and Ukraine, I think what people really try to make the metaphor is because Ukraine and Taiwan are both countries stand at the forefront of the authoritarian regime expansion. And if you are familiar with military or strategic studies, scholars believe that China and Russia, they share similar strategic purpose, try to kind of expand from the inner lands of Eurasia to 2 different directions. They are collaborating with each other. So Russia is moving towards the other side, toward the west, and China is moving towards the east. And from that perspective, you can understand why people say that. But I also have to argue that we still have a lot of difference, between Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine. The first one is that we have a Taiwan Strait lying in between. It's more than 100 kilometer width. It stopped the PLA from launch amphibious landing attack against Taiwan because it's extremely challenging for them to establish the logistic all the way from the southeastern coast province of China to Taiwan. That's the first point. The second one is that we have a very strong support from the United States. Even though they have a strategic ambiguity, but they said it in public for so many times that Taiwan is so important, even more important than Ukraine. I'm not saying that Taiwan is totally safe. I'm not saying that, but I am trying to say because we had a extended deterrence constructed by US and Taiwan, and Japan is kind of joined the deterrence to some extent in recent years. And the third one is that if a war really happens in Taiwan, it will also become very different because Taiwan is so tiny. Our territory is only 6% of Ukraine. We don't have strategic depth. So you don't see a tank warfare in Taiwan. Taiwan is so small. So the maritime, naval and air force will play the major role. So the picture will totally different. The second question is about traditional security and economic security. I think the easiest answer is that you equals TSMC into economic security. And then the decision for Trump becomes, would you prefer kind of having a grand bargaining related to US and China's economic interest? Or that means you have to kind of give up TSMC to some extent. Some strategic even suggest that maybe we have to send aircraft, to send bomber to kind of destroy facility in Taiwan. That's crazy, but they say that. You can see it on the news. And like Professor Newsom mentioned, it is not easy to reach a grand bargaining between China and the United States. last December, I was in Washington, D.C. I noticed that in that week, it was in mid-December, at least 3 major delegations from China visiting Washington, D.C. and New York, trying to probe the possibility of any solutions or any kind of way to reach a compromise or agreement with the United States in terms of US-China trade war or so-called tech war, meaning technology export restrictions. So it's not that easy. And the third point is about Taiwan's public opinion. I have to say that people in Taiwan, they have a certain kind of immune on these issues, which means whenever scholars talk about Taiwan is not that important, maybe US should give up Taiwan because the coast is so huge. We don't have to do that. It's not a good bargain. Guess what? It makes no influence for people in Taiwan because we know it doesn't represent US decision-making level. But if it is a decision made by the US president, of course, it reflects on Taiwan's public opinion. Last time was when the US withdrew from Afghanistan. And it is true that the so-called people's confidence on US support to Taiwan kind of decreased overnight. I don't remember exactly, about 10%. And this time, after Trump and Zelensky, they have a quarrel in White House, it reflects similarly. So I have to say people are still worried about the supreme leader of the United States kind of policy or decision making. But if that is only a short-term rhetoric, that means maybe there will be some comeback afterwards. People will pick up their confidence afterwards. That is the case for after the Ukraine withdrawal. After that, people's confidence to Washington, D.C. resumed to the normal percentage at around 50-some% in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you for these great questions. I think I'll take 4 of them, and I'll start with Mark's excellent question about this idea of a reverse Nixon. So this is something that gets discussed in U.S. circles. I personally tend to be among those who is quite skeptical of it because I think it misunderstands, in the first instance, what the premise of Nixon and Kissinger's diplomacy in that period of time was premised on, and it misunderstands the nature of the China-Russia relationship today. It's really important to emphasize that the only reason that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were able to initiate the discussions with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong that led to the normalization of relations was the Sino-Soviet split, which was real and very much an opportunity to be taken. As far as I know, there's no parallel to that right now in the China-Russia relationship. I did see, I think yesterday, that Russia is among the countries that is unhappy with the flood of Chinese EVs and is putting restrictions on that, but that is not the Sino-Soviet split. It is very clear that Putin and Xi Jinping have an understanding about long-term shared interests and are still attendant to that relationship. So the opportunity there is not the same as that presented itself to Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. There has been for a long time in certain China hawkish circles in the US this notion that partnering with Russia would be advantageous in that orientation vis-a-vis China. This was very robust in our political discourse before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't know that it is as plausible today as it may or may not have been before that moment. But that leads me to addressing a second point about the difference between Ukraine and Taiwan. I think there's obviously, at the outset, we should say there's a clear difference in terms of international legal standing. Ukraine is clearly a sovereign nation that was invaded. There's no question about that. Whatever Vladimir Putin thinks, is the historical, claims of, the imperial czars over that area, that is not the same as saying that there's an international legal justification or any kind of, anything that, prevents this from being understood as an invasion of one sovereign power by another. As someone who's entirely supportive of Taiwan and of maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait, that is just not the position of Taiwan vis-a-vis China. It just isn't. And it wasn't in 1949, in 1979, or today. When you went back and looked at this issue, and of course, a lot of things have changed since then, but if you went back and looked at this issue in the 1970s, neither leader of China or Taiwan would have accepted the notion that these were two sovereign nations. They just both thought that they should rule the other one as well. So it's different. So I think that's a starting point, but that's maybe more of an academic point. The main point that I want to say on the difference between Ukraine and Taiwan, it's really interesting to see how much President Trump has been able to bend the opinions of many of the people on his side of the aisle and in his administration on the Russia-Ukraine issue. There are numerous people in his administration who 6 weeks ago were saying very supportive things of Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine and very negative things towards Vladimir Putin in Russia, who are no longer saying those things. That is remarkable. And it begs the question of, does he have the same ability, if he wanted to bend views vis-a-vis China and Taiwan? I tend to be skeptical of that. I think that the amount that has been invested in bipartisan, but especially on his side of the aisle, in identifying the challenge that China poses and identifying Taiwan as an American strategic ally, essentially, is so deep that I think it would be hard for him, even if he wanted to, which I don't have any indication to know that he would want to, but if he wanted to kind of pull the same thing off that he's done vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. It's just very hard to imagine. So, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, they may be saying things today vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine that is very different than what they said 6 weeks ago. I just don't think that the political bandwidth is possible for that to happen vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. And part of, I think, maybe and I don't know these people, and I'm speculating here, but I think part of their mental calculus vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine is if they think, that whether it's reverse Nixon or something else, that this is useful for focusing on the real threat of China and the threat to Taiwan. Maybe that's their intellectual justification. But in any case, I think on that there is a clear difference, which then leads me to the third question about the timeline. I think of the potential Chinese action vis-a-vis Taiwan. I think if we were having this conversation at the later stages of the Biden administration, I could have very confidently said that, yes, there are a number of people who in recent years have suggested there's a very particular timeline that Xi Jinping has for an invasion of Taiwan, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, whatever. But I felt comfortable with the consensus among many of the people I tend to agree with that the costs of an invasion of Taiwan would be so great that they would dissuade China and Xi Jinping from acting unless cornered in a position where they had to act to maintain their own legitimacy at home. And so this kind of argument would say, as long as we don't put China in a corner, which would maybe suggest something like a corner would be if you encourage Taiwan to declare independence and then recognize that, and you said, okay, this is it. This is over. Taiwan is independent, a sovereign nation. Forget about it. That would be the kind of existential corner that Xi Jinping and China would probably have to respond to for their own legitimacy at home. But if you took that out of the equation and you just said, okay, status quo, I felt very confident that there was no particular timeline, that it made sense within the domestic Chinese political context for Xi Jinping to say the same things that many Chinese leaders have said in the past vis-a-vis Taiwan. But the cost and benefit analysis of actually acting, accentuated by seeing that Putin's, 3-day planned takeover of Ukraine turned into, 3 years, that all was sufficient to dissuade. And so the interesting question for me now is, has that changed because of what we're seeing now? And there are people who suggest that, comments like what Trump says vis-a-vis Greenland or Canada or the Panama Canal, maybe the endorsement of what Russia has done in Ukraine, that all of this potentially changes the calculus in Beijing. I understand why people say that, but to me, that's still more in the realm of what I would call sort of Twitter commentary than real world. Like real world, I think the costs of China taking aggressive action are still too high, and the potential spillovers are too hard to control. And so I don't, even today, I don't think there's a particular timeline, especially when China is continuing to do gray zone tactics that, they can sort of see like a progression over time. And then the last thing I'll just say on the TSMC, that was a good point that you mentioned that. And the only thing that I want to add here, and especially for a French audience, is that whatever the domestic political standing of your president, which I know nothing about, but on the world stage, as far as his relations with President Trump, he seems to be the only world leader I can think of who actually stands up to President Trump, and that President Trump kind of respects for doing that, which is very interesting, because it does seem that the people who just give Trump what he wants don't necessarily get anything in return. Like if Trump, you give him things you want, and you just ask for more. And so I would worry a little bit if I was the Taiwanese, that in the same way that, I think a lot of European leaders have to think about, if you just give him what he wants without getting anything in return, you have no guarantee that you're going to get anything. Like he's perfectly happy to have set the rules of the game where you give him things what he wants. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to give you anything in return. And so I would just be very cautious about thinking that in particular is something that somehow secures Taiwan's future in a meaningful way.
Thank you very, very much, Nessun. If I can very quickly challenge your previous position on the timeline, I fully agree on the diagnostic. However, with one caveat, is that the framework that you've drawn is a very rational paradigm. And at least I am very, very not confident about Xi Jinping's own rational paradigm. And we cannot be completely sure that economic prosperity like all the costs that you mentioned are the priority of the CPC right now. And this is what pushed me to be much more cautious on this potential timeline that could come sooner than we thought. Jojo, you wanted to add something? And then I will take some questions, so please give me a sign.
Very briefly about timelines. I think it's very interesting. Maybe some of the people notice that, like Newsom just said, there's no timeline for China to take over Taiwan. But there is one thing which is called 2049. Xi Jinping like to restore China's glory. I mean, for glory for the Chinese nation. Do you think China can resume its glory without taking Taiwan back? That's one part of the so-called 100 humiliation they are repeatedly mentioning. So a lot of people in Taiwan worry that maybe 2049 could be the so-called end game for China. And of course, before that, a lot of people mentioning about Xi Jinping instructed the PLA to get prepared, not invaded Taiwan by 2027. And then another theory is about 2035. I just give you some objective assessment and information. And in addition to traditional amphibious landing attack, I think what is more likely to happen is about so-called blockade or quarantine against Taiwan, because Taiwan is fragile in terms of its energy supply security, especially natural gas. So a lot of experts talking about that. And even though Taiwan may not kind of surrender right away, but through kind of a game like that, they can weaken Taiwan step by step. That is why some US think tank mentioned that China can coerce Taiwan and someday in the future reach capitulation. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So just these, that's a great dialogue. And so I just, just two very quick things. One, on your point, which I take as a very good critique. But I would submit that at least of these three leaders that we've talked a lot about today, Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping has done a lot of things in China that I disagree strongly with, but I tend to think he's acted rationally. I don't have many examples of irrational behavior. So it could be that that still is on the horizon, but at least vis-a-vis Putin and Trump, it's easier to see a rational framework imposed on sort of Xi Jinping's decision-making than the others. And then I just wanted to say about 2049 at least, the best thing about 2049 is that it's 24 years from now. So that's, let's get through the next, 5, 10 years. 24 years from now there's a lot that can change in 24 years. But I do take your point that the gray zone tactics are deeply concerning. And I think if we did, at least, the US or the West wanted to, genuinely support Taiwan's position, there would be more attention paid to not just the military component, but also this gray zone component, which is quite concerning.
So just for the record, I didn't say that Xi Jinping was irrational. I'm saying that his rationality is perhaps to put security and ideology first for the survival of the party, rather than putting economic prosperity. Because if we look at his track record over the past 12, 13 years that he's been in power, he did nothing for economy, like no economic reforms, nothing. And the economy today is not good in China. On the contrary, he made so many reforms, so many that I cannot list them all right now. Considering the PLA, domestic security, the data security, and I could go on and on, financial security and so on. So that's what I'm saying, that his priority, his rationality, in my view, seems to be more inclined to security and ideology. Now, if you have questions, please raise your hand and we will circulate a microphone. So please introduce yourself and ask a quick question.
Hey. Hello, Central News Agency of Taiwan here. My question is about, like you said, like Taiwanese tend to argue that we have somewhat strategic importance for the United States. And the first one is that Taiwan is in the first island chain, and that it will give access, if it was taken by China, to the direct access to the United States. And the second is TSMC, as we said. But there's an article written a few weeks ago on Foreign Affairs. The name is American Strategy Shouldn't Hinge on an Unwinnable War. And it says that its argument says that the balance of power in Asia does not hinge on the control of Taiwan. It's the ties of America is more, the ties with Americans' other allies, for example, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, is more important. Even if Taiwan even if Taiwan was taken by China, the balance of power will not be destroyed entirely for the United States. That's the first question. And the second question is, and the second argument is that even if China took TSMC, United States has the ability to cut off all the supply chains, the components, and intellectual properties that is crucial for the chips. So Americans wouldn't be really afraid of China taking TSMC. So I would like to know your takes on these two arguments.
John, you want to go first?
For your question, a lot of people in Taiwan read that paper, but just like I say, it's from academic community. My personal opinion is that Taiwan has been stationed there from ancient times. So strategically speaking, is it a pivotal point of first island chain? It is not decided by Taiwan itself. It is decided by US decision makers. The second point is about TSMC. It's important, of course, but they related to your second questions. Even if China take over Taiwan and hold the TSMC manufacturer capability, you are right that United States can control the upper stream of the supply chain. That is true. But my personal response to your two questions is that I don't agree with the two scholars' article in Foreign Affairs, because no matter how important Taiwan is, First Island chain in itself is a grand theater for the defense of the United States. Taiwan is part of it. If Taiwan kind of fall into the hands of China, China will get a kind of gigantic aircraft carrier, which no one can shatter. And the defense of Japan or Filipino or down to even Australia will become totally different, I would say. And maybe US defense would have to withdraw back to Guam or Hawaii, I don't know. Maybe that is the so-called sea air defense proposed by some American scholar maybe about 20 years ago. There will be a totally different picture. Would never be what the two scholars say, the balance of power remain roughly uninfluenced. I don't agree with that part. Thank you.
So I think the main things I want to say in response. First, so I'm not familiar with that particular foreign affairs piece, but that's interesting that it was read in Taiwan. Who are by the way, who are the authors, just out of curiosity?
Even can remember.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, who are
It's Jennifer Kavanagh and Stephen Wertheim.
Oh, okay. So Wertheim, I know where he fits in the kind of political debates. So I think, so two things. One, it does seem clear to me that if the US wants to maintain credibility in the Asia Pacific, including with some of these other countries like Japan, Korea, Philippines, it is essential that we maintain the status quo vis-a-vis Taiwan. I think that does have really large implications. That's my own view. But then as to kind of the approach to take, I'm convinced by a phrase in a different foreign affairs piece by Ryan Hass and Jude Blanchette from a few years ago, where they basically argue that the best solution vis-a-vis Taiwan is to find a way to kick the can down the road and not try to resolve anything right now, because resolving things right now is impossible, but potentially kicking the can down the road is possible. And they have a sentence that I'll read out. They write, ultimately, Washington faces a strategic problem with a defense component, not a military problem with a military solution. The more the United States narrows its focus to military fixes, the greater the risk to its own interests as well as to those of its allies and Taiwan itself. And I tend to believe this very strongly. The more, and in order to kind of do the strategic posturing, I understand that you want to do things that sort of convey military deterrence. But whenever you get in these conversations, when it gets really deep into just the military component of it, that takes us to a very dark place, in my view. You know, I don't think we want to go all the way down that chain, because it just opens up too many uncertainties, including, you know, is there actual US support at a popular level for American troops to die in Taiwan? Probably not. I mean, I could be wrong, but probably not. So, you know, do we want to go to nuclear war over Taiwan? Probably not. Does the Chinese military have the ability to do lots of bad things to American aircrafts in that area? Yes. That's not to say that, you know, who wins, who loses, but if we just get stuck into thinking in this as a military thing, I think we are going to trap ourselves in a very problematic place. But if we can, through diplomacy and wisdom, find a way to maintain the status quo, otherwise, to me, that's the best we can do. And that's, you know, whether or not that's going to be the approach of the Trump administration, I can't say, but it is, in my view, the best way to secure Taiwan's position and maintain the, you know, US interests in that region for the foreseeable future.
We have 2 more minutes if there is any question left. Okay, there. So let's ask both questions very quickly.
Good evening. My name is Sean Margot. I'm an American student at the Sorbonne. My question is, how do European strategies and actions in the Indo-Pacific impact the calculus of the US, China, and other actors in the region?
And just behind you.
Thank you. I'm Commander Fergal, researcher at the Center for Security Studies at Ifri. You mentioned the possibility of an embargo in Taiwan to choke the island, not debating on the legal issues of such an action. How do you see the willingness of United States, but also other like-minded countries in Asia, to commit in such a scenario to break blockade and obviously sustain or support Taiwan effort to resist such an hybrid action? Thank you.
Answering to the second question, embargo or blockade or quarantine, but very interesting, China never used the 3 terms. They use the term called Feng Kong. Feng means seal, Kong means control. The purpose is, in one way, that is their military term. The second way is that they try to avoid any military international law related behavior. So whenever they are doing similar action like blockade or quarantine, they use the term Hong Kong. Actually, they did it last year. So we did have many rounds of wargaming discussion, especially TTX, tabletop exercise discussions with our American friends, Japanese friends, talking about how if China really impose blockade quarantine against Taiwan, and how if that kind of action lasts for, say, like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or even longer. And my impression is that the United States got the strongest willingness to help Taiwan. It depends on how you describe it. To help us escort the liquid natural gas vessels coming to harbor in Taiwan, because you need a big tank for natural gas. And some people, I'm not sure about it is true or not, that we did sign agreement with the United States. They agree that if something like blockade or quarantine happen, the United States is willing to send their military vessels to escort their own natural gas vessels into Taiwan. But you don't have to take it for 100%, but I'm trying to say that we have been discussing about the possibility and how are we going to tackle that. Thank you.
I'll just say one quick word about the blockade. And I'm not, to be very clear, both the questioner, Dr. Lee, are much more deeply versed in military things than I am. So I'm definitely out of my depth on this. But even at just a very simple level, I know that one of the questions around a Chinese military action vis-a-vis Taiwan is how long does the US have to get there? And if it's a blockade, they have more time to get there. So, from a Chinese strategic standpoint, I'm not as sure that it makes as much sense to give the US all the time it would need to get everyone there. And so maybe that would be a reason that the Chinese would be less inclined to go in that direction.
You're totally right. Because what China really wants from Taiwan is that they can start an action and finish it as soon as possible, so that the international community don't have time to intervene. And not to mention that Taiwan is constructing its third and fourth kind of tank for natural gas storage.
As you see, so many questions remain open, and this is just the beginning of the continuity of the debate, and we will keep having this debate here at Ifri. Just a short advertisement, because the Ifri Center for Asian Studies team has humbly tried to put some ideas in a collective report published in January, on January 20th, the day of the inauguration of Donald Trump, which is named the Indo-Pacific and Trump 2 in Uncle Sam's Brutal Embrace, and this is available online on Ifri's website. Before thanking our panelists, a big thanks to Ifri's team, especially John Seaman from the Center for Asian Studies, Camille Deniso-Chiang for helping putting together this event, but also Barbara Delansoy and Mela Larbès who deal with the logistics. And now please join me and join your hands to congratulate and to thank our dear panelists. Thank you.